Hello and welcome back. My name is Ralph Clayton, and I'm your host. This is episode 9 in the Volumetric Time Model series. So far in this series, we've been building the framework, step by step. We've talked about the difference between existence and access. We've talked about why forecasting and control are not the same thing. We've talked about agency, horizons, and about the strange experience of seeing what is coming while still failing to change it. Today, I want to go deeper than that. Today, I want to talk about the picture underneath all of it. The picture of reality that makes these ideas make sense. And that picture is this: what if time is not best understood as a stream of moments being created, one by one? What if it is better understood as a bounded spacetime volume, containing a set of complete histories that are allowed by physical law and by boundary constraints? That sounds abstract, so let me say it in a more human way. Imagine you could step outside of time the way an astronaut steps outside a spacecraft. And then imagine looking back at your life the way you look back at Earth. Not as a ticking sequence, not as a line of disappearing nows, but as a whole shape, a complete structure, a world line, a thread through space-time. From that viewpoint, yesterday and tomorrow are not gone, and not yet. They are locations, coordinates, parts of one larger geometric object. That is the picture we're working with today. And if that sounds strange, that's fine. It should sound strange at first. But the weird thing is, physics has actually been pushing us toward this picture for a very long time. Relativity already tells us something extremely unsettling. If you really sit with it, it tells us that no is not universal. There is no single cosmic present slicing cleanly across the whole universe. Two observers moving relative to each other can disagree about which distant events are happening at the same time. That means simultaneity is not absolute. It depends on motion. And once you accept that, a lot of our ordinary language about time starts to look less like physics and more like human convenience. That doesn't mean our everyday way of talking is useless. It means it is local. It works for ordinary life at ordinary scales. But it is not the deepest description of what reality is doing. The volumetric time model takes the next step. It says, stop imagining reality as a conveyor belt producing moments. Start imagining a bounded region of space-time, with laws and constraints, containing a set of admissible histories. That is the phrase for today. Admissible histories. Complete histories that are allowed because they satisfy the rules. Now, before that gets too heavy, let's slow it down. Because this is actually much simpler than it sounds. You do not need the whole universe to talk meaningfully about a real problem. You never actually deal with the whole universe. You care about a region, a patient over 12 hours, a storm over 2 days, a market over a week, a spacecraft during a burn, a person during a decision, a conversation that changes a relationship. You always care about some bounded situation. So the first move is simple. Draw a boundary around the thing you care about, not a mystical boundary, a modeling boundary. What counts as inside for the purposes of this question, and what counts as outside? Once you do that, the outside world is not ignored. It enters through the boundary. Signals cross the boundary. Energy crosses the boundary. Inputs cross the boundary. Constraints cross the boundary. That is how the outside matters. And inside that region, the laws of physics still apply. The dynamics still apply. The conservation laws still apply. The structure of the system still applies. So what do you get when you combine the laws inside with the constraints at the boundary? You do not necessarily get one single inevitable history. You get a set of allowed histories, a family of complete spacetime stories that satisfy the rules everywhere in the region. That set is what I call the atlas. And honestly, that one image does a lot of work. Because once you have the atlas, the question changes. The question stops being, does the future exist? That turns out to be less useful than people think. The better question is this: what in the atlas is accessible to an observer who is embedded inside the system? What can actually be inferred? What can actually be known? What can actually be influenced? That is where things get interesting. Because this is the point where VTM stops being a poetic reinterpretation of relativity and becomes operational. It refuses to blur everything into one mushy word like fate. It separates 3 layers that people constantly confuse. First, there is the world itself. Whatever is actually happening in the region. All the detail. All the hidden couplings. All the microscopic mess. Second, there is the model. The way we represent that region as a bounded space-time volume with a set of admissible histories. And third, there are the constructs we derive from that model. Things like what can be inferred, what can be influenced, where horizons appear, where forecasting survives after steering fails. Those are not the same layer. And if you mix them together, you get confusion immediately. You start accusing the model of saying magic things it never said. You start acting like a consistent future means an observer must somehow be able to read tomorrow, like a book. It does not mean that. That is one of the biggest points in this whole episode. Existence does not guarantee access. Just because something is part of the structure does not mean it is available to you. That difference matters a lot. Now a fair objection comes up right away. If the atlas is already there, doesn't that mean everything is fixed? And the answer is not in the way people usually mean. What it means is that the admissible histories are globally constrained. It does not mean you, as an observer inside the volume, know which history you occupy. That is the key distinction. Global consistency is not the same thing as local knowledge. You do not stand outside the atlas holding it in your hands like a god. You are inside it, and that means your access is partial. Your experience is partial. Your knowledge is partial. What you get is not a complete history. What you get is a record, data, signals, measurements, memories, reports, photons reaching your eyes after a delay, instrument results after processing, messages after routing, memories already filtered by attention, emotion, and sleep. That is what you have, a growing record. And this is where the model becomes almost painfully ordinary. Because once you say it clearly, the mystery starts to thin out. The cosmos is not waiting. You are the one receiving. That line matters. The cosmos is not waiting. You are the one receiving. Uncertainty, then, is not necessarily some grand cosmic coin flip. A lot of the time it is just bookkeeping for partial access. Early on, many admissible histories still fit the little record you have. Later, more evidence arrives, and fewer histories still fit. The corridor narrows. You call that learning. You call it clarity. You call it realizing what was really going on. But from this perspective, what changed was not reality becoming real. What changed was access improving. That is a very important difference. Let me make it concrete. Imagine watching an eclipse through a telescope feed that keeps freezing. Every few seconds you get a frame. The eclipse itself is not stuttering. Your feed is stuttering. At the beginning, with only a few frames. Multiple trajectories could fit what you have seen. Later, as more frames arrive, the path becomes obvious. Now notice what did not happen. The celestial mechanics did not suddenly become real when your confidence increased. The eclipse did not decide itself when you got enough frames. What changed was your inference. That is the shape of the thing. And once you see that, a lot of modern life starts making more sense. Why can one person feel dread early while another person still sees noise? Why can a skilled clinician sense deterioration before the dashboard fully confirms it? Why can a meteorologist see the storm before the public sees rain? Why can someone feel a relationship ending before anything official has been said? Because the present contains structure. The world is constrained. The atlas's shape. And if your channel of access is good enough, or your model is good enough, or your intuition is trained enough, you can sometimes read the corridor ahead better than other people. That is not prophecy. It is not mystical foresight. It is not time travel. It is structured inference from the present. No information needs to travel backward. Nothing supernatural has to happen. You are not peeking into tomorrow. You are reading the present more deeply. That is a completely different claim. And it is a much cleaner one. Now this is where another important distinction appears. A future outcome can be strongly implied by current constraints and still remain inaccessible to you in one of two ways. Either you do not yet have the right data, or you have some understanding, but you cannot convert that understanding into timely influence. Those are different failures. One is an access problem. The other is a leverage problem. And the reason VTM is useful is because it separates them instead of blurring them together. Because once you blur them together, people start blaming themselves for powers they never had. They think, if I could see it, I should have stopped it. Not necessarily. Seeing and steering are different. Inference and control are different. Knowing and influencing are different. That separation has to be installed early, or the whole discussion turns sloppy. Okay. Now I want to spend a minute on this idea of the bounded region, because it sounds technical. But it is actually one of the most practical parts of the model. A boundary is not a wall. A boundary is a promise. It is you saying this is the region I am talking about, and everything outside it will matter through coupling, through boundary conditions, through what crosses in and out. Without that promise, you are not really modeling anything. You are just gesturing at the universe. And that sounds deep, but it is not useful. Real science always carves out a region. An engineer does not model the whole planet to analyze a bridge beam. A doctor does not model the whole universe to talk about a 12-hour crisis. A meteorologist does not model all of eternity to talk about a storm over 2 days. You choose a region because you want a well-posed question. And once that region is chosen, the boundary becomes important. Because the outside world still couples to the inside. Temperature crosses, signals cross, interventions cross, radiation crosses, pressure crosses, information crosses. The boundary is the handshake between your chosen volume and the rest of reality. And once that is clear, the atlas stops sounding mystical. It becomes disciplined. It becomes the set of histories inside the region that satisfy the laws and fit the coupling. That is all, not fantasy, not free invention, constraint, defined possibility. Now this also helps explain something people often misunderstand. When they hear bounded volume, they think you are claiming the whole universe is literally a finite box. That is not the point. The bounded volume is a modeling lens. It is a way of making a question precise. You are not denying the rest of reality. You are saying for this question, this is the region, and the rest enters through constraints. That is exactly how real modeling works. And it matters, because once the region is clear, you can say something honest about what is known, what is unknown, what is accessible, and what is not. Now let's move to the observer again, because this is where the emotional force of the model lives. An embedded observer never holds the whole story. An embedded observer holds a growing stack of clues. That is a useful sentence. A growing stack of clues. Each clue arrives through a physical channel. Each channel has delay. Each channel has noise. Each channel has blind spots. And because the stack grows in one direction, you experience the direction as time flowing. That is one of the deepest points in this framework. The sense of flow may not be a property of the whole geometric object. It may be a property of an embedded mind, accumulating evidence in sequence. Your lived present is the edge of your record, not necessarily a universal blade in reality. The edge of your record, and that idea explains a lot. It explains why the future feels foggy. The fog is not necessarily metaphysical. A lot of the time the fog is missing data. It explains why surprise feels like reality changed. Often reality did not change in the relevant sense. Your record changed. A new clue arrived. A corridor collapsed. It explains why hindsight feels so brutal. Because once later evidence arrives, the admissible histories narrow sharply. And what was once ambiguous now looks obvious. Not because it was obvious at the time, because your access was worse then. That is a very important moral correction. People are often cruel to themselves in hindsight because they confuse late evidence with early visibility. They think, I should have known. Maybe not. Maybe the clue that made it obvious had not arrived yet. Maybe the corridor only became legible to you once the record improved. That is not a moral excuse for everything, but it is a real feature of embedded life. And ignoring that feature makes people stupider and crueler than they need to be. Okay. Let's make the same point in another way. Think like a detective. A detective walks into a room after something has already happened. There is one actual sequence of events that took place. But the detective does not get the sequence directly. The detective gets clues, a footprint, a timestamp, a witness who might be wrong, a camera angle that is blurry, a broken object, a phone record. At first, several narratives fit. Then more evidence arrives, and most narratives die. Now notice what nobody says. Nobody says, the past was unwritten until the detective figured it out. Everybody understands that the detective is converging on what happened through partial evidence. VTM says something similar is happening with the future, too. You are inside a constrained system. The present contains structure. Your record is partial. As more evidence arrives, your belief about which corridor you occupy narrows. That is not the future, being created by your awareness. That is your awareness becoming better, calibrated to the corridor you are already in. Now another consequence follows from this, and it is one of the most useful ones. Two observers can stand inside the same reality and carry very different practical futures, simply because their records differ. One person has access to an early measurement. Another does not. One person knows an important constraint. Another thinks it is negotiable. One person sees the faint signal. Another sees only noise. That difference is not mystical. It is operational. Different access means different practical futures. And once you realize that, a lot of confusion in human life starts, looking less like disagreement about reality and more like disagreement caused by unequal records. One person is ahead in the corridor, narrowing process. Another person is not. And this also explains something very modern and very painful. Warnings can exist without changing outcomes. That sounds contradictory until you separate access from influence. A warning is information. Information changes belief. But belief does not automatically become leverage. Leverage is about whether action can still couple to outcomes in time. That is a separate question. And if you do not separate those questions, you will keep expecting awareness to automatically produce power. A lot of suffering comes from that mistake. Now I want to say something even more direct. Probability, in this framework, stops being mystical very quickly. It becomes accounting. That's all. Accounting over still, viable histories, given the record you currently have. Imagine a locked room containing a machine. You cannot open it. You only receive weak, glitchy sensor readings. Inside the room, one actual physical evolution is happening. But you do not have it. You have access to traces. At the beginning, many internal trajectories could fit the few readings you have seen. Later, more readings arrive, and fewer trajectories remain plausible. Your uncertainty shrinks. Nothing about this requires the machine to be creating itself in response to your attention. Nothing requires a cosmic dice roll. It only requires you to admit that you never had full access in the first place. And that admission is actually liberating, because it turns metaphysical drama into something testable. Instead of asking mushy questions like, is the future real? You ask better questions. What is the bounded region? What are the constraints? What are the admissible histories? What is in the record? Which histories are still compatible with the record? What measurements would narrow the corridor faster? Those are scientific questions. Those are tractable questions. Those are honest questions. Now, I want to return to something subtle, because it matters a lot. When new evidence arrives, you are not just updating your view of the present. You are updating your belief over whole histories. That means late evidence can change how you interpret earlier events without changing those earlier events themselves. That is very important. It explains why one new fact can make the whole story look different. The road did not move. Your map match improved. That is an excellent way to think about it. The road did not move. Your map match improved. And once you understand that, a lot of weird human experiences stop needing mystical explanations. Why did that number suddenly make everything feel real? Why did that scan suddenly change the whole story? Why did that message suddenly reframe the last 6 months? Because your belief over whole histories shifted. A corridor you were leaning on got killed. Another corridor became dominant. That is not the world changing its mind. That is your record becoming sharper. Now I also want to emphasize what this model does not claim. Because people hear these ideas and instantly start smuggling in science fiction. It does not claim that messages travel backward from tomorrow to today. It does not claim that consciousness creates reality. It does not claim that observers stand outside the atlas and choose from infinite magic branches. It does not claim supernatural foresight. The claim is much more mundane than that. And because it is more mundane, it is more powerful. The present contains information about likely later developments, because physical systems have inertia, coupling, structure, and constraints. If you capture enough of the right signals, you can infer a likely corridor ahead. That is physics plus statistics plus partial access. That is all. And honestly, that is all is doing a lot. Because a lot of modern confusion comes from people refusing to take constraints seriously enough. They keep wanting surprise to mean the world was open in some magical way. Sometimes surprise just means your record was weak. They keep wanting certainty to mean metaphysical truth, descending from heaven. Sometimes certainty just means the compatible, set narrowed sharply. They keep wanting inevitability to mean fate in a mystical sense. Sometimes it just means the atlas had a dominant corridor, and your record finally caught up to that fact. That is a much cleaner vocabulary, and it is a much safer one. Now let's zoom out for a second. Why does any of this matter beyond philosophy? Because it changes how you talk about modern life. It gives you a clean explanation for why dashboards can be accurate while interventions fail. It explains why a situation can become more legible. At the same time, it becomes less steerable. It explains why hindsight feels morally crushing, even when what really happened was late arriving evidence. It explains why two people can inhabit the same event, but live in different practical realities, because their access channels differ. And that matters because if you do not have this language, you end up moralizing everything. You end up treating delayed access like laziness. You end up treating low resolution signals like stupidity. You end up treating late clarity like hypocrisy. You end up blaming people for not seeing what their channels did not yet deliver in usable form. That is bad thinking. It is also bad ethics. Now, there is one more layer here that I want to make feel intuitive. The world is not obligated to synchronize with your awareness. That sounds obvious, but emotionally, people often act like it is false. They act like things happen when they find out. But astronomy already teaches us better than that. When you look at a distant galaxy, you are seeing ancient light. When you look at the sun, you are seeing it with delay. Nobody says the galaxy becomes real when you look at it. Nobody says the sun waits for your retina. You understand instantly that there is a difference between what is and what arrives. VTM says, keep that same honesty in ordinary life, because the same separation is happening everywhere. You are always living at the edge of a delayed, filtered, partial record. The delay is usually small enough that the illusion of immediacy holds. But when systems get complex, when variables are hidden, when the stakes are high, when delays accumulate, that illusion breaks. And then the harsh truth appears. Reality does not owe you a clean feed. That is not pessimism, but is just embedded life. And once you accept that, the whole theory becomes much less spooky. You stop demanding that uncertainty mean an unfinished universe. You stop demanding that the future be unreal until it becomes visible to you. You stop treating your notebook as the world itself. You start admitting that what you have is a record, and that record is powerful but incomplete. Now let's bring it all together. A bounded spacetime region gives you a disciplined way to define the problem. Physical laws and boundary constraints define a set of admissible histories inside that region. That set is the atlas. An embedded observer inside that region does not possess the atlas directly. The observer possesses a growing, delayed, noisy record. Belief is then a weight distribution over which admissible histories are still compatible with the record. As new evidence arrives, the weight shifts. The corridor narrows. The observer experiences that narrowing as learning, clarity, and sometimes certainty. The observer experiences the one-way growth of the record as temporal flow. That is the picture. And once you hold that picture clearly, several important things become easier to say. The future can be constrained without being fully accessible. Uncertainty can be real without requiring cosmic indeterminacy. Clarity can arrive late without reality having been late. Prediction can be possible without magic. And human experience of time can be vivid and directional without requiring a universal cosmic no-gam. That is a pretty big payoff, because it means you can keep physics and experience in the same frame without lying about either one. Now let me land this in the most human way I can. Most people live as if reality becomes real when it reaches them. That is understandable. It is how embedded creatures survive. But it is also the source of a lot of confusion, a lot of shock, a lot of guilt, a lot of false metaphysics. Because if you mistake your record for the world, then every surprise feels like creation. Every delay feels like destiny changing its mind. Every late clue feels like reality suddenly becoming definite. But if you separate the world from the record, a calmer and more precise picture appears. The world has structure. Your access is partial. Your certainty is conditional. Your surprise is often late evidence. Your feeling of temporal flow is tied to the growth of your record. That does not make life less real. It makes your experience of it more intelligible. And honestly, I think that matters. Because precision is kinder than confusion. Precision says, maybe the corridor was there before I could see it. Maybe my uncertainty came from partial access, not from the universe waiting for me. Maybe the world was constrained long before it became visible. Maybe my lived now is not the edge of all reality. Maybe it is the edge of my record. That is a much deeper idea than it first appears. Okay. Let's close with the simplest summary possible. The volumetric time model asks us to stop picturing reality as a stream of moments manufactured, one by one. Instead, it asks us to model a bounded region of space-time and define the set of admissible histories allowed inside that region by physical law and boundary constraints. That set is the atlas. An observer embedded inside the region does not directly read the atlas. The observer receives a partial, delayed, noisy record. Uncertainty is not necessarily the universe being undecided. It is often uncertainty about which admissible history you occupy, because your access is incomplete. As evidence arrives, belief narrows over whole histories. That narrowing feels like learning. The one-way growth of the record feels like temporal flow. The future can therefore feel open without requiring it to be metaphysically unwritten. It can be constrained and still inaccessible. It can be highly inferable and still not yet visible to you. And that is why the difference between the world and the record is so important. If you confuse them, everything turns mystical. If you separate them, time becomes stranger but also clearer. Okay? In episode 10, we are going to take the next step. Because once you understand the atlas, and once you understand the difference between the world and the record, the obvious next question is this: how does an embedded observer actually update belief inside that structure? How do admissible histories get weighted? How does evidence narrow the corridor? And how does that set up the later split between knowing and influencing? That is where we're going next. Thank you for listening. My name is Ralph Clayton. This was episode 9 of the Volumetric Time Model series. And next time, we'll talk about how an embedded observer turns partial access into belief, and why that still does not guarantee power. See you soon.